bit about me. I've been at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia for 40 years. Actually, this year is my 40th anniversary. I started teaching at Curtis when I was about 9 months old. And I've been there ever since. Mr. Sirkin, Rudolph Sirkin, brought me there. And when he invited me to teach, and I was very, very young, he brought me into his office and he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to hire you. And if it works out, well, you have a job at Curtis. If it doesn't, well, you can put on your resume that you taught at Curtis for a year. And I've been there for 40 years, and I've been, had the great privilege of having all these incredibly gifted and brilliant students. And actually, I call them colleagues over the years. And Curtis is an extraordinary place. Well, I'm going to do something that I don't ever do, that I never do in my classes, and that's read something. Because what I have to say, part of what I have to say to you tonight is so specific, and I really want to make sure that I get it right. Because in a way, it tells you what I think are the essential ingredients in music that connect all human beings. And I think in the world today, we need to hear things like that as often as we can. And before I start my little speech, I just want to, something came to me as I was coming here, and there's an expression, always the same, but never in the same way. And it's a Latin expression, but I'm saying it in English. But if you think about it, all organisms on the face of the earth exhibit that. They're all the same, but never the same in the same way. And actually, language is certainly like that. We express language using the same basic principles, but there's never any end to the things that we can say. And I believe that music is like language in a very non-trivial way, in that it is always the same, but never in the same way. So I want to share with you some examples of music from around the world, and I also want to read to you a little speech or a statement that I've made. So let me start first with some examples from world music. How does this go here? Okay. Now, some of these sounds may be a little strange, but it's my belief that they're not going to be that strange. Now, bear in mind that this is music from all parts of the world. And I'm going to start with an example from the Congo, in the heart of Africa. And the reason I'm playing these examples is, well, let's let you figure it out. All right, I'm going to ask a musician, what's the first interval that you hear in this? Basic interval. Anybody know? It's a third. It's a minor third. That's an ubiquitous interval in music. Let's keep going.
Mana boye, wali ya wate Io che mo che lo fatto, chi conosce ito, non è finire le partite. E finire le partite na ya, e finire le partite na
All right, now, the musicians, something else has happened. It's more than one voice singing, so this is polyphony. The first interval we heard was a third. Now, what kind of entity are you hearing? Isn't there a chord, a triad that emerges? Right. So intervals and chords are ubiquitous elements in all music. Now, you also hear in this African music at least 3 percussion instruments playing, and they're playing relatively complicated rhythms called polyrhythms. Most African music is always accompanied by this kind of metric element, and the vocal lines always follow the basic melodic patterns of the speech. And most sub-Saharan African languages are tonal, and they use pitch in a kind of way that is almost like discrete pitch in music. Let's go to the second example. Okay, all right. That's an example of Georgian polyphony from Georgia, around the Black Sea. What's the similarity between the African piece and this piece? Do you hear any similarities? Do they sound the same? What's the different way? They both use intervals, right? There are triads or chords that are part of the mambo music, and there's certainly chords that are present here. Actually, this is a 4-voice polyphonic composition, and there are 2 voices that are holding the same notes throughout, and the other 2 voices are moving around singing the poetry. One of the common features of most world music is that it's built on a drone or a grid or repeated pitches or sustained pitches. That's actually the basis of tonality. And I'd like to also point out that most of this music is completely improvised. It may be based on some melodic formula, but the performance itself is completely spontaneous. And the repeated fragments are a way to keep the basic idea going. And these are ancient traditions, been for thousands of years, and the musical traditions that I'm playing now certainly are some of the oldest, and a lot of them are beginning to die out. But these are musical traditions that have been in place in their own society for many, many years. I'll play just one more example. that example is a little more like the last example that we heard, right? You hear the same chords, chord progression, very close harmony. What does it almost sound like? Anybody, what? What kind of a quartet? Barbershop quartet, right? It's very close harmony. Well, in all of these examples, you hear basically the same material, basically the same intervals, and actually basically the same way of putting the music together. But they all sound different, using the same materials for different expressions. Tonight's program, as I understand it, is about storytelling in music. Well, what is a story? Well, my grandmother used to say to us kids when some great disaster would have happened around the house, and we, of course, denied responsibility for it, she would say, "Are you telling me a story?" Because we always made up some elaborate reason why it couldn't possibly have been our reason for the thing happening. In essence, she was really saying, "Are you telling me what actually happened? Or are you just lying to me? Or just making something up?" Well, the great literary critic George Steiner says that the main use of language, and indeed of all art, is to create palpable lies or stories. That's an interesting remark, I think. Now, what he means by that is not that we don't communicate or tell the truth, but language itself, our capacity to use it, is not necessarily anchored in an actual correspondence of things, but rather abstracted away from things by the primary resource that language and thought provides, which is imagination. René Descartes, the great 17th century scientist, although it was called philosophy back then, perceptibly noted that human beings' capacity for language lies not in its communicative properties, but in its creative use. So many times we say something we don't literally mean in order to say something we actually do mean. And I'm just not talking about figures of speech or metaphors, but the truly inexplicable creative capacity to imagine something like aliens at the borders in blue dresses, or flying reindeer. Those are all things that we say, but they're completely imaginative, and at one point, they were never thought of before. These imaginative, spontaneous, and improvisatory qualities of language distinctly and uniquely define our humanness. My recent work at Curtis and in my own private research, it attempts to find out what might be the deep correspondences between this creative dimension of natural language and the similar, if not identical, dimension, but that is in natural music. And by natural, I am implying to mean the unmediated facility to just say something randomly, either spoken or musical. The ancient tradition of storytelling, and it is a very, very ancient tradition, is surely rooted in improvisation and imagination, just as musical storytelling is. Well, I've already said a mouthful that would really take an encyclopedia to really begin to explain. But I think it's fairly uncontentious to say that language is indeed a kind of generating process or generative process, and it takes very limited means and produces an infinite result. In the same way, natural music in all cultures is a kind of generative process using very limited means to produce an infinite array of musical expressions. It can be argued, and can be argued really quite forcefully, that all languages at their core consist of universal properties of organization, and that the differences that you see in languages and in musical styles very much lie on the surface. So I would like to say, instead of the popular and misleading term diversity, I like to use the more appropriate expression distinction. I really don't mean the same thing. If we investigate natural music from around the world, and you've just heard 3 examples, one from Sardinia, one from Russia or from Georgia, and the other from the Congo, and we could go on, we find very much the same organizational phenomena throughout. There are only a very few basic relationships between tones and pitches, and they are used to create an inexhaustible flow of musical expression. The complexities that emerge in the natural phenomenon of tonality, which all this music represents, and the music that you're going to hear tonight certainly represents, are essentially a product of the mind having found a way to unite this generative process that creates language with musical pitch. And it is surely one of the greatest things about human beings. So even if the music lacks words, it's still capable of building up a structure that anyone, if you listen carefully, can easily be perceived as having a theme, a beginning, a middle, and an end, as well as embracing a means of engaging the imagination. And I know that the 6/4 Trio and all the other great musicians that are here tonight in the Garden Festival feel and understand these basic universal properties of music, natural music. And they're here to share just a few of these ways with you. Infinite ways that music and words too can fire our creative imagination through stories. In doing so, they are certainly celebrating the most human of human capacities, creative abilities. Language is uniquely, humanly creative. Let me say that again. Language is uniquely, humanly creative. And so, as my story goes, is music. It is a common bond, and as Dave Hickey, one of my great idols in art criticism, so beautifully admonishes us, make your creativity rhyme with the beauty in all its distinctions of our shared human experience. I think that's a beautiful remark, the fact that we make our creativity rhyme or coincide or resonate with all of our shared human experience. And that's the end of my basically prepared remarks, and I hope I've communicated something to you about the innateness of music and the fundamental uniqueness that music has to being a human being. And it is something that is unique to all human beings, and all human beings can understand, appreciate, love, and communicate and be imaginative in music. Thanks for the opportunity.